It's my very great pleasure today to be joined by Alex Fergusson, who is one of the foremost experts on not just drones physically and the technology of their manufacture, but also on the evolving drone tactics and strategy that we are seeing in the Ukraine war, or the war in Ukraine, the war against Ukraine, to get the terminology correct. I'm going to get Alex to introduce himself in a second, say a bit more detail about his scale of expertise and, of course, his commitment to Ukraine. Before we do, thanks to everyone who supports the channel, especially via Patreon, Buy Me Coffee, and of course, all those who are supporting our fundraising campaign to get trucks, 4x4 trucks, for the 93rd Battalion. You'll see a little video later in this clip of the guys on the ground describing why they need these vehicles. They literally save Ukrainian lives, and they also literally help to hold the Russian marauding army at bay. So please, if you can help, do. There is a description in the link of the video. Alex, welcome back to Silicon Curtain.
Great. Thanks for having me back.
This is, of course, your
Um,
second time because we had the pleasure of chatting on stage. I think it was last year.
Indeed. And I had a nice display then with a range of my drones, from our little 5-inch racing drone all the way up to our 20-inch long-range bombers or mothership drones. So bit of background. Until recently, I was the CEO of FAC Technology, who was the designer and manufacturer of initially World Cup winning racing drones, up all the way up to drones, FPV drones, purpose designed for combat. The company is not a startup, one of these new pop-up drone companies. I founded the company in 2010, and we'd essentially developed niche composite materials and adhesives for the aerospace and defense industry. So if you consider a satellite or the launch vehicle that puts a satellite in space, a drone, because it's unmanned and autonomous, then actually we've been doing drones for quite a long time, but purely as a supplier. Whereas, I only got back about a month ago, but I was essentially spending most of my time flying drones made of my company's materials, but manufactured in Ukraine by a Ukrainian company. And we were mostly going out, testing those, speaking to units or various parts of the armed forces of Ukraine, going to polygons, figure out how the training's done. So yeah, that is my background. Essentially, material scientist with 3 degrees from Imperial Colleges who somehow pivoted into designing combat drones.
And let's say it as well, a keen supporter of NATO. There we have. We have the cup on display there.
Even got the same T-shirt as we had for our first interview.
Yes. Um,
Obviously, watched since then.
Obviously washed, and I think it's incredibly important to have a foot in both those camps. Let's cover two topics that I think you almost immediately raise. One is the importance of battle testing in Ukraine, and not just, superficially, but actually having sort of logged success against elite Russian units. That's the first point. Then the second point I want to come to is something we started to discuss in the first interview, and that is the importance of reducing or eliminating China and its allies from the supply chain of components throughout a drone's manufacture.
Okay, so point of correction: the day we went out, I talked about when my drones got absolutely wrecked and dropped like flies. It was an elite Ukrainian unit. So this was a field test in Ukraine against essentially elite operators for the unmanned systems forces, and we had a bad day, shall we say, against their EW teams. But in terms of the importance of testing, there was another company who was out there testing. They had an American comm system, not that, and frankly, they did a test flights. They weren't actually doing an official trial, and we had to run for cover because they went out and started flying. Obviously, someone fired up an EW system somewhere, and the drone came hurtling back, totally out of control. So we were screamed at, the drone is out of control, we have no control. And it basically just slammed into the area where we were all, taking off from. So I literally had to run and dive into a tent just to put some form of barrier between myself and this drone. Me and the CEO of another company who, we'd been at testing for various other FPV drones, and both of us went up to them and just like, what the hell was that? Because obviously this is a serious risk to life. Like the drones, like I had a 20-inch drone there. Their drone was substantially bigger. You get hit by a 20-inch plus prop, it doesn't need explosives. You're dead. That prop's not stopping until it hits bone. You're going to bleed. We had tourniquets and stuff, but we weren't happy about it. And I wasn't the only CEO who was not happy about it. And the question we asked is like, what testing have you done? It's just like, well, we've been up against NATO jammers and it was fine. And it's just like, yeah, this is not a NATO jammer. This is, it could be a Bukovel or it could be a Russian equivalent operated by Ukrainians. This is not like going up against NATO. And they hadn't bothered to come out to Ukraine and test it. And unsurprisingly, well, at least to me and Howard, it's just like, well, of course it didn't damn work. Like, unless you're out here, like I've been up against NATO jammers, zero problem. Up against Ukrainians with Ukrainian and Russian jammers, get absolutely wrecked first time.
And
Now,
it's not
yes, you
about just
get,
jumping in and jumping out, is it? I mean, there's a very high rate of innovation, and indeed, certain techniques at certain points of the front will work, and at other points of the front they won't. So, is it not also about being or having a sort of semi-permanent or a permanent presence in Ukraine, or having Ukrainian partners who can test on a continual basis?
well, that was my logic, but then I got removed as CEO. So obviously, some people disagree. But if you look at how my company started, yes, I completely agreed. So for our communication system, we work with a Ukrainian company called DroneSpace, sometimes better known through their NGO Dronania, because they had one of the first training schools for drone pilots. There's a really great interview on Bloomberg actually with the CEO of DroneSpace, Maxim Sharamet. One of the things he says is like, for drone pilots, our brain is our rifle. We're not assault troopers, so train the brain. So one of his things was he wouldn't train you to be a pilot until he trained you to be an engineer. Because he's like, if you can't adapt the drone and repair the drone in the field, there's no point in me teaching you how to fly the drone because you're not going to be able to fight it because you need to understand that, okay, the enemy have new jammers in the area. Okay, this is how you use a spectrum analyzer. This is what they're jamming. This is how you unsolder the comms, and this is how you solder in comms, which will then work in whatever EW gap your spectrum analyzer picks up. So, yeah, my logic was we've got to work with Ukrainians, otherwise, we're just going to go nowhere. And this is also the logic for working with a little outfit based in Kyiv, because most of their work is actually not so much making drones, but like retrofitting them for units. So a unit will get a whole bunch of drones from say the government, but they won't be quite right for where they're operating or at that period of time. So a lot of their work is these adaptations to keep the drone current and combat effective. So it's like, okay, I'll get these guys. I will train them how to make drones of my company's designs in Ukraine, and that way they can assess particular units' needs. And different units want different things. Like actually, the last time we saw each other was with Richard at Frontline Kit,
Indeed, it was.
and what was it? Is it 9030? I can't remember. Is it IDAR? Which is one of the Halo units he supplies, but they have a very specific way, very specific specification of how they want their drones, and that might be different to other units. So the local producers are the people who are best placed to adapt to what the units need for where they operate. And that was my logic. Work with Ukrainian companies because they speak to the guys, they know what's best, and they can adapt, which is very, very hard to do if you're just back in the UK.
We'll take a short break from the story to dive into the burning question of how we consume media and act on that information. Let's face it, our media is in crisis and people's attitude towards media sources as well. For me, ground news is an essential tool for us to take back control of the media we consume and rebuild our personal agency over that information. Let's take a specific story, for example, one that's breaking, but one which some outlets have chosen not to feature. But with ground news, we can find enough sources to get a strong overview of the story as well as a wealth of detail. Ground news will show you the biased distribution of coverage. In this instance, the story is covered by more right-leaning publications than left or centre. Some outlets both side the issue, suggesting Ukraine thinks that this is an unacceptable offer. Some go further and explain why it is unrealistic and disingenuous. Well, you can't fix the bias and framing of individual media sources, but you can immediately see all the ways in which the story is framed, get a fuller picture, and come to your own balanced conclusions. You can dig further to understand how media ownership may influence the framing of the story. And you can also click through to related topics for ease of browsing or research. Ground news does not eliminate bias, but presents you with the entire landscape of media coverage of a story. It allows you to spot the biases in headlines and then the detail of content. It's a far better way to detect bias in news sources and develop the analytical skills to navigate the news on your own terms. This is, of course, super relevant to me as I draft news bite scripts daily, sifting through hundreds of media sources and stories to try and craft truthful, detailed, and impactful stories. Ground news has become an essential tool in my interaction with media and research workflow. Ground News delivers all the benefits I'm looking for in a news aggregation tool. It helps with information overload. It ensures that sensationalism does not win out over facts and detail, and it can help neutralize the impact of manipulative algorithms. Ground News is an essential tool to relearn how to trust information sources. More than that, trust yourself to curate news content, get value from it, but also to be analytical and critical. Subscribe to get 40% off the Vantage link by scanning the QR code on the screen or using the Silicon Curtain specific link, which is ground.news/silicon. This can also be found in the video description and the pinned comment. When you subscribe, you'll get access to both the website and the app. And that leads to a whole bunch of questions. We'll come to sort of China and the supply chain a bit later. I mean, it suggests that there needs to be an incredible level of adaptability, not just in terms of hardware and being to swap out components. It suggests that in some instances you may have to 3D print, different parts, maybe even the field. You have to be able to take them in, take them out, but also suggests a certain fluidity between hardware and software. You need to be able to sort of hack and adapt both of these and almost see the drone as a process, as a system, rather than simply a product.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the reasons why the Ukrainian military has such a strength because it's a civilian army. So you have people there who you know maybe they did engineering at university. They know how to use CAD software, so they can design and 3D print whatever is needed in the field. And if you go out to the brigades and stuff, you will see they all have their own workshops. They have their own 3D printers. But because it's a civilian army, they have people with the skills to make those adaptations. Whereas the Russian army is a bunch of paid mercenaries or conscripts. They don't have an army of mechanical engineers, aerospace engineers, software engineers who can do these adaptations in the field. And that is probably why the Ukrainian military is so much more innovative. Yes, the Russians inevitably copy and catch up, but the Ukrainians are the ones delivering this innovation because essentially they've just got much smarter soldiers.
And that really leads to a zoo, the approach in Ukraine, which is a sort of zoo of different competing technologies, companies, units. That can make it difficult, I think, to share insights, share knowledge, and propagate those learnings across even battalions that are more advanced level, let alone some of the battalions that are still perhaps stuck in a sort of outdated mindset that are not able to innovate. So there is this issue, isn't there, of patchy application of that innovation. But of course, the Russian vertical approach is to take something that works, not tinker too much, but then introduce mass and scale and production capability. So you're basically seeing two, not just economic models fighting against each other, two ways of organizing everything from innovation, science, cooperation, trust. It's a fundamental clash of civilizational models, I would say, being conducted at the moment through predominantly drone warfare.
Um, yeah, I think you're right, and that there are pros and cons to both approach. So the Ukrainian approach, very distributed manufacturing, hundreds and hundreds of small players. Um, what's the advantage of that? Uh, they all try different things. So these guys are all trying to differentiate themselves, come up with some competitive advantage because, frankly, this is a direct-to-consumer market in that space, except the consumer is soldiers. So they need to be innovative. That's great. They come off, they will try loads of stuff. 99% of it won't work, but every time something does work and is an improvement, that will be adopted. That's fantastic. Disadvantages. It's not scalable so rapidly. If an innovation is developed by the Ukrainians and the Russians get a hold of it, reverse engineer it, they're just going to essentially scale it and ramp up production with their centralized procurement system. Now, the question that comes here is, okay, how do we give Ukraine that advantage whilst maintaining the innovation? And I think we're starting to see some experimentation here from Ukraine's friends. So um, there's been an announcement of co-production of drone airframes in the UK, which I think is a fantastic idea. I can't remember. I think it might be Skyton. I've actually been to their place a couple of times. That would be fantastic because if you look at, say, their drones, so these are fixed wing ISR, intelligence, surveillance, recon drones. The wings are basically very thin fiberglass, laid up by hand, incredibly labor intensive. That's fine. Ukraine does have some history in composites because they have a big marine industry. A lot of boats are made of fiberglass. They know to handle fiberglass. There are some supply chains there. But if you want to really industrialize that and ramp that up, where is the supply chains? Where is the expertise? Where is the equipment? The UK has that in absolute spades. So I think the idea of taking a combat proven Ukrainian design where they are continuously adapting it so we can learn how they continuously adapt it, but then make it in the UK and take advantage of our skill base. An example of where things could be improved, unfortunately, I'm going to have to go to the Russians here, is look at the initial Shaheds. So those Shaheds were made by a process called wet layup and vacuum bagging, and they literally just mix resin together in a bucket, pour it on a fiberglass, get a brush or a roller, and then basically put everything in a bag and stick it to a vacuum pump. Some of the Russian drones I've seen, in fact, you might have even seen it in Dimko's and Era's garage. There are some of their fixed wings there where, if you look at it closely, you can clearly see that those parts were made using a process called RIFT or VARTM. That stands for resin infusion under flexible tooling or vacuum assisted resin transfer molding. Widely used processes in the wind turbine industry. Much more reliable, much faster, much cheaper, but requires some investment in skills and materials. That's just literally just lying around the UK. I know so many companies in the UK, you could just go, hey, here's a design. Can you make this via VARTM or Rift? And they would just crank those out at a quality and probably a lower price than the Ukrainian company could, even though our labor costs are much higher because they have the equipment and the experience to operate that equipment effectively. So yeah, it might, our labor costs are much higher, but to make a wing might now take them 2 hours versus the 8 hours for the hand layup in Ukraine, and your scrap weight's going to be much lower and you're going to waste less material. So that is potentially a case where Ukraine can keep the innovation. They're really good at it with their, distributed manufacturers, lots of these small players. But once there's a working product, which units are going, this thing's great, we want more, that's giving a demand signal. And then maybe that's where those companies go, hey, we've got this demand. We want to ramp production, improve quality. Can we do it in your country? Can we co-produce with you? And we'll make we'll make for our own country's needs. But if you want to buy some more, just pay for some overtime shifts and then you get your own as well. That way we're building up domestic production capacity. The Ukrainian company is getting access to capital because it's much easier probably to get investment and finance a factory in the UK where it's less likely to get blown up than it is in Ukraine because we
Not
have
a
more
zero
developed.
chance. We'll come to that
Not
in
a
a minute,
zero.
but less likely, yes.
Yeah, I'd say less likely. I'd say drone space. They've had a factory essentially blown up. Policar have been in the press recently. The subject. They've also had a place blown up. Sabotage and is not uncommon. Also, Baikar, they've had their place in Kyiv hit 4 times by missiles now. So it's a non-zero chance here. We've seen sabotage on, humanitarian centers delivering aid to Ukraine, but it's a much lower chance. And also access to capital insurance is viable here, whereas I think it'd be very hard to get insurance for a weapons factory in Ukraine.
Absolutely. And the need for this, of course, is ramping up considerably. Uh, um, we'll come back to the ecosystem of drones, I think, in a minute and talk about Brave One. But let's tackle really the title of the episode. And that is that we're seeing over European airports bases in a kind of early phase of drone-enabled grey zone warfare. Russia is using cheap, low signature systems to probe our sensors, escalate politically, impose costs on air traffic. My belief is they're going to go to the extent of trying to shut down European civilian airspace, but also they're stealing our time and attention, and potentially they may convince some countries to keep air defense systems for themselves rather than give them to Ukraine. So, what is your impression seeing these Russian tactics unfold? And again, there are some out there saying, "Oh, but we don't know it's the Russians." I mean, really, come on. We are going to get rolled over unless we name the opponent who we are fighting with. It's like the Harry Potter. You've got to call the bad guy by his name, or else they've already won. But what's your impression of what's unfolding?
I'd say failure to attribute the blame to the Russians, even if it's someone paid by the Russians to do it indirectly, that's already a victory for them. Um, and in terms of what are the outcomes we've seen so far, we've seen a number of different outcomes. Every single one, if you think about it, has been a win for Russia. So let's take the drones, which were shot down by F-35s and F-16s. Okay, an F-35 costs over 40,000 euros an hour to operate. Those missiles, which they use to shoot them down, cost millions. So, okay, we took four down. By the way, one of our AMRAAMs didn't work, failed. Unfortunately, it hit a civilian building, but fortunately, it didn't explode. So no lives lost. Who won that encounter? I would say the Russians, hands down, won that encounter. Okay, let's look at drones over airports. People seem to have a short memory. This is not the first time this has happened. Last year, drones were flying over US Air Force bases. I think it's particularly worth noting is that
In
these things
Britain,
are
that was
lit up.
bases in Britain,
Yeah,
wasn't it? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. These drones are lit up like Christmas trees. They have LED bars added to them, so they are very, very clearly visible. So when you were saying undetectable, I would say, well, it's pretty obvious that that
Yes,
is
that's it.
essentially that is Putin's middle finger. Those LED bars. It's a very, very clear statement. Undetectable. I'm not sure about that. Maybe undetectable to NATO armed forces, but I'm pretty certain if you sent out some Ukrainians, they might have a different response. An example I would give to illustrate this is military drone racing tournament last summer. I was there. We were demonstrating our kamikaze drones because people wanted to see a kamikaze drone. But there were people there marketing their electronic warfare, essentially drone guns, which is essentially you have a power electronics chip which just creates white noise in a certain frequency, and it's got an antenna, a directional antenna. It looks like a shotgun, but the idea is you essentially just blast white noise. So this is basically like screaming in someone's ear, so they can't hear anything. It's the same to a drone. If you scream loudly enough at it, it can't take commands, and it will eventually just drop out the sky. And they were like, look, it's fantastic. You can go from 2.4 gigahertz, or you flip this button and it's 5.8. It's like, makes sense. That's what DJI drones operate on. So if you want to drop a DJI drone, keep that thing in your roughly in sight for 20 seconds. The DJI will fail safe and drop out the sky. What happens if they're not operating on 2.4 and 5.8? So, for example, the drones that first batch of our large drones sent to Ukraine, videos at 1.2, 2.4, and 3.3. All right, you can jam the 2.4, but because it's got a drone space ground control station with a multiplexer hooked up to it, it will just hop to the other frequencies. So you've knocked out just one channel, still perfectly flyable. If that's all our guys have got, what happens if these Russians have go on to AliExpress and bought a 1.2 gigahertz video transmitter? What happens if they've gone and bought what's called a Gemini ELRS system? So this is a system which has band hopping between it, which is so essentially if you have your controller, these publicly operate on something called ELRS protocol. You can now get ones which have inherently multi-band capabilities. So you can buy this off AliExpress. It's totally fine, and there are things you can do to it, shall we say, which means you can operate on unconventional frequencies. The Ukrainians know how to do this. Russians do it as well. And if you have a spectrum analyzer, you'd be able to pick it up. But Do we have troops who know how to use spectrum analyzers? Does the Met or Transport Police know how to use a spectrum analyzer? Listen out for ELRS signature protocols and go, okay, it's using this comms on this frequency. So if we need to jam it, that's the frequency we jam on. Now, Ukrainians know this. I'm not sure our domestic security services do. And they probably don't have the kit to even pick it up if they did understand it.
Yeah, neither the training, the kit, nor the full integration, I'm sure, of these things. What I perhaps should have said is not the drones unidentifiable. I mean, I guess if they really didn't want to be spotted, then that's different. But they clearly do want to be spotted. It's more perhaps the operatives that are difficult to identify. And yet there seems to be a curious conjunction of Russian ships just happen to be in the area or in the vicinity of these drone ranges. It has been alleged with the recent sightings in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark.
Yeah, I'm a bit skeptical in that because just because of the range involved. So let's take a typical F. So these drones don't have ammunition attached; they're not carrying payload. But just pure line of sight, unless you have a rebroadcasting system, just the curvature of the Earth can limit your ability to maintain comms. Now, this is surpassable. We've literally seen Russians operating drones via satellite from Moscow in Ukraine. So doable. I'm not sure the boat needs to be there in order for that to be done. But they can be flown locally. If you're within 20 kilometers, you've got a decent ground control station, you can just fly that thing. And 20 kilometers is a pretty big radius. But there are ways of going further. In fact, I'd almost suggest that we should take a lesson from the Russians. Well, I say it's not the Russians because the Ukrainians have operated stuff from Lviv out near the front. But maybe we can take a lesson from both sides here. It's just like, okay, we don't have the skilled people who know how to interrogate these signals and then know how to deal with them. Ukrainians do. Maybe is there a case that we can have translators? You and I know some people who've translated for like Operation Orbital stuff there. Maybe we can have Ukrainians essentially come in over the internet, be shown the signal from a spectrum analyzer, and if there are any problems, tell them how to set it up and configure it. And maybe we can get Ukrainians essentially as a remote force to augment ours whilst we learn what we're doing, because we don't have a clue, but they know exactly what they're doing. And obviously, we have to reward them handsomely for it because that's taking them away from defending their own country if they're defending ours.
And this is where I start to sort of perhaps disagree a little bit with some of the so-called geopolitical experts, including some that I have huge and unbounded respect for. Many of the ones are ones that sort of believed that a full-scale invasion was coming towards the tail end of 21, when many others were skeptical. They now say that Russia doesn't have the armor or the infantry capability or the capacity to, say, invade the Baltics. But I think that it's a real risk. It's not a risk that we should be discounting. Let's take the scenario that all the drone incursions we're seeing are not just tests of political will, but tests of or which precede a scaled up attacks. For instance, what if Russia was to do mass drone incursions and actually drop payloads onto civilian and military airports across Europe? What if they were to cut cables simultaneously? What if they were to take out electricity substations? And we've seen, curiously, a lot of electricity substations going mysteriously wrong in Britain over the last year. That has not been particularly reported that much. What if all these were to happen simultaneously with a mass Russian incursion along the Suwalki Gap, or even an attempt to sweep through the Baltics while we are trying to deal with absolute chaos, power outages, internet outages, and mass outages of transport logistics and communication in Europe? We could be facing Europe's Pearl Harbor.
One of the things I wrote and delivered half of the lecture course on composite materials at Imperial College. And one of the things sorry, this seems a bit off topic. I'll bring it back, trust me. One of the things I always taught when I was describing any mathematical model for how composites materials behave is what are the assumptions behind the model? how confident are you in those assumptions? Because if your assumptions are wrong, then your model's going to be wrong. It doesn't matter what data you put into it. If your assumptions are wrong, your model's going to be wrong. Rubbish in, rubbish out. And this goes to the assumptions. Okay, how are people looking at this? I'm going to say, let's look at this from a Russian perspective. Let's look at this from Putin's perspective. I don't think Putin will be able to survive a peace. I think the information warfare that they conduct domestically, their domestic propaganda, says that the Russian people are in an existential fight for their existence against NATO. So this is a narrative which I think most people would agree on is being pumped in Russia. So if the narrative is that there needs to be information to be used to maintain this narrative, because frankly, without it, Putin's probably going to fall out of a window. So he needs to maintain a narrative that Russia is in an existential fight for its life with NATO. So say things die down in Ukraine, or they make no progress, or hopefully what we see is they start to lose territory in Ukraine. So Russia starts losing territory in Ukraine. It looks like Russia is losing. The narrative in Russia, which we have seen, is like we're losing because we are fighting NATO, not Ukraine. We are fighting NATO. How do you get your people back on side? And it's probably to show that you've punched NATO in the face. So I don't think this is going to be a full-scale invasion of Europe, because absolutely they would just get the floor wiped with them. But if Russia needs to demonstrate a victory against NATO, because that's who the Russian people think they are fighting, then they need to demonstrate a win against NATO if Ukraine is giving them a bloody nose on the behalf of NATO. And yeah, I would say the Savlaki Glap is well documented, but also Transnistria, we've just fortunately seen a wonderful success in Moldova. If Russia can't win with propaganda in Moldova, then maybe they will try and have little green men there. So I think question the assumptions. Like, they can't do it. It's like they know they're not going to win. But what is Putin's objective? I think his number one objective is to not fall out of a window or drink polonium tea. If he needs a win against NATO to ensure his ongoing survival, if it's essentially an unwinnable incursion or death, I think he's going to take the unwinnable incursion for a couple of years and see how far he can push it. And if you're going to do that, then you're going to shake the space beforehand. You're going to send in drones, you're going to test, and you're going to try and fragment alliances. You're going to try and also drain resources from your enemy, which we say, people in our country think we're not at war with Russia. Russia is very clear in its thinking it is at war with us. So how can it destabilize or demotivate its enemies? Us. And drones in asymmetric warfare are an incredibly cost-effective way to do so. And
When you
frankly, we've done
stack up
nothing.
when you stack up the number of incursions, the sabotage, the attempted assassinations, and all of the actions which can plausibly be attributed to Russia, and all of the actions which are still difficult to attribute to Russia, but which fit potentially with their strategic objectives and have some kind of, let's say, pattern matching with their technique. It's an incredibly long list. If you were to just look at that list, and I've done a few episodes on this, if you just look down it, you would no longer think we were not at war. This is a country that is trying to test and degrade every aspect of our infrastructure and indeed our politics institutions. On that point of NATO there, I mean, if Putin is being, if he's taking his head out of the trenches and not just concerned with his own survival, and not getting, the infamous altitude cancer, then he may also have a more grandiose objective, which is to show that NATO is ineffective, to show that NATO is redundant, to essentially make the alliance appear as it's non-existent. That would suggest an increasing level of tests of NATO will and resolve. As you say, so far it has not exactly passed those tests with flying colours.
Yeah, and I think, okay, I'm a material scientist and an engineer. I'm not an escalation theory expert. But every time a boundary is pushed and there are no consequences, that essentially resets the limits. So if Putin sees that there are zero consequences for flying FPV drones or any like a Mavic or whatever over a US Air Force base in the UK or shutting down air traffic in the Nordics. Why would he not keep doing it? There is zero cost to him, only benefit. So, I think you're just going to see this incremental escalation in their tactics. They're just going to keep pushing, and as long as there is no consequences to them, there is no cost to them. They will keep doing it. Or, frankly, even better for them, if the cost is far greater to us than it is to them, like what, force your heads for God knows how many millions. Why wouldn't they do it? If you were saying like Putin, he's a psychopath, but he's rational in some ways, it seems. If there is no response, or the response is massively asymmetric in their advantage, why would they stop?
That's it, especially if it pushes us into thinking that we should engage in another sort of Minsk type agreement and foist an unreasonable peace on Ukraine. Not that I think we have the capability to do that anymore. What we talked about earlier is another front which people are barely talking about, and that is the advance in naval drones. Now, we've all seen those fantastic videos of, especially in the last week, the naval drone coming into one of the key Russian ports. Try as they might, they try to shoot them out of the water, and they can't, and then it hits their targets. It's wonderfully dramatic. And then you've got the added soundtrack of Russians leaning out of their windows, swearing profusely, almost as if they're watching some extraordinary kind of entertainment rather than involved in a war. It's a little bit bizarre. But with this evolution of marine drones, that also, I think you were suggesting, represents a significant threat to, I would say, Western naval hegemony. And it's one we're perhaps not facing.
Yeah. Think back to World War II. We almost lost World War II due to Nazi submarines. They, as you have like Hodges and Petraeus and people like that, and they constantly say war is a battle of will and logistics. You need both. And freedom of navigation, I think, is something that we take for granted, but it's it's so important. I think this is demonstrated in our naval fleet and the American naval fleet, and also in our enemies' actions. Like, look at Iran backing the Houthis. What are they trying to achieve when they are attacking vessels? They are threatening freedom of navigation because they understand that actually our society, the things we take for granted, are underpinned by freedom of navigation in the maritime domain. So what happens if Russia just sees no escalation? Russia, for those who aren't aware, now has its own naval drones. I mean, obviously they're years behind Magura or Sea Baby, or the latest iterations which we've seen, just wrecking havoc again. Wonderful to see. It's glad to see they found some targets. They were running a bit short for a while, but Russia's now making their own. If they continue to see no costs for their escalations with flying drones, why would they not use a naval drone? If they have the capacity to make them, what's to stop them being deployed in the Baltics or being sent to Iran or Iran's proxies to threaten freedom of navigation there? Or they probably have a few favors they owe to China, and I'm sure China would be very interested in how they could harass the Taiwanese and the Philippines with such drones. And even more worrying, okay, it's taken a couple of years to catch up with like a Magura, and yes, they're still years behind. But what happens when they catch up with the Polokar drones, the submarine drones? How do we attribute? Like, we can see these drones flying with their bloody great big LED lights, and we're not attributing them to Russia. If we're not going to attribute something which is literally blindingly obvious because it's so bright with those LEDs, what do you think our ability or our willingness to attribute blame should a submarine drone start hitting naval vessels be, or marine vessels? And I think we're setting a very poor precedent because we can literally, I said, sorry for the pun, blinding. That's the LEDs are so bright, and we're saying, oh, we don't know who it is. It's not attributable yet. It's like, okay, what are we going to do when we start seeing Russian submarine drones? When
Hmm.
you say, oh, it's not definitive who it is, it's like,
Yeah, it's not an open declaration of war. It's not like, haha, that was us. It's literally a ship sinks or lists or sustains massive damage, and no one actually claims accountability. It may even hit civilian vessels, and there the onus on proving who did it may be even less. That is a terrifying prospect for sure. Let's turn quickly to a topic that we mentioned in the first instance, and then we left hanging, and that is the importance of trying to exclude China from the supply chain, from providing various components that go into a drone manufacture. Where are we in that process? And in the context of Taiwan and what we're seeing here of authoritarian learning, which is where Russia is undoubtedly sharing some of its knowledge with China. And it's reputed to also be sharing both physical landing craft technology and expertise with them. How important is it that we cut China out? And where are we with that?
Um, so it depends what you define as we. If you include Ukraine, actually not too badly. And I think it was great that when President Zelensky was on the floor of the UN, he said he's going to let Ukrainian companies export some drone technology and components. That actually could be to a phenomenal advantage of us. So one of the things I was doing when I was out flying drones in Ukraine is we were building essentially, so my former company, so FACT drones, so Ghost of the Fuse, but we were building them with Ukrainian flight controllers, Ukrainian speed controllers, Ukrainian motors. Um, and I could only do that in Ukraine because you're not allowed to actually export those components. So there are perfectly good Ukrainian-made motors. Sure, the magnets may come from China, but you can get them from Switzerland as well, just a higher price. But there are Ukrainian companies who can essentially fill a large part of this gap. The fact that they're allowed to export is fantastic because then hopefully they can sell them for a higher margin to their allies. And then rather than buying a Speedy B, probably the most popular Chinese flight control stack in FPV drones, we can buy from Viri or VTN for our ESCs. So we, Collective West, doing poorly. But frankly, the Ukrainians may be a path to save us. And this could be an area where I think there could be very effective collaboration. Like there are companies in the UK who supply the aerospace industry, and they make basically circuit boards, very similar to a flight controller. And the entire production line is essentially robots. So there's no humans involved. And that's how they are cost effective, even though they manufacture in the UK and they supply to aerospace. So the quality is exceptionally high. Maybe this is a case for some sort of collaboration where, Innovate UK or UK Research Innovation goes, we got a problem here. Or DSTL, Defense Science Technology Laboratory goes, we've got a bit of a problem in our supply chain. Innovative Ukrainian companies appear to be solving it domestically for their needs. So they think they know how to do it. Their products work, literally combat proven. But maybe we can find a way to get them to collaborate with UK companies, like this British company I was talking about. I can think of two my company were working with who have these almost entirely robotic production lines. Maybe there's some way to entice them to work together such that we're not reinventing the wheel. The Ukrainians have a product, it works. Let's get a Ukrainian company to work with British companies where the British company has something to bring to the table, like expertise in the automation of production of PCBs. Yeah, I think this is going to happen. Like, there's been great news about like the Danish being very innovative here, in terms of their co-production, like enticing Ukrainian companies to work with Danish companies. So hopefully we will see more of that. The Ukrainians have solved the problem. So rather than try and solve it ourselves, can we just pay the Ukrainians to come and do it in our own countries and find a way to give them something in return? Could just be financial remuneration, like please set up a factory here, we'll subsidize a loan for your new factory. Or, okay, there's some stuff which Britain does, or Germany, or whomever, or France. It's like, we have some unique capabilities which you don't have. Can we get you to take your capability and work with companies which have unique capabilities to come up with something better? And then both sides win.
The last area I want to focus on, and I think this is the most speculative area, but it's already advancing. We can see that already the early sort of iterations of this are involved in combat, although it's got a long way to go before it is more effective than, say, human operators. But that is the use of autonomous intelligence on drone assets. And there's certain directions in which this is going, and this isn't to talk about anything that isn't sort of necessarily public, but it's being able to, spot, identify targets in a whole range of different circumstances, including some where you have various complex visuals and so on. There's a lot of problems to solve. Then there's electronic jamming. Then there's the idea that you may be able to have a competent drone operator, not just using sort of one-to-one, but using AI. You may be able to have some kind of network effect so that one operator can actually handle, more than one drone, maybe even up to the level of dozens of these. So where are we at with this, and what are we likely to see with the evolution of AI-driven drone warfare over the next year or so? Considering that I think it's highly unlikely the war will end within that time frame, within the next sort of 6 to 12 months.
Okay. So in terms of where we are at with AI at the moment, as is funded by, say, no, let's take the International Drone Capability Coalition as an example here. So if you look at the large FPV tender, one of the requirements was autonomous terminal guidance, minimum lock-on distance, 500 meters. To get 10 points out of 10, you have to be able to lock on from 3 kilometers. And I remember looking at this going, 3 kilometers is like, okay, in what weather conditions? What if it's foggy? Like this is just an arbitrary, this is a science project as far as I can tell. Because like, what is the logic for the autonomous lock-on? Now, if you speak to guys out here who fly these things, it's because if you look at the videos of FPV drones, you see the video degrades as it gets closer to the ground. And the reason for this can be as simple as the curvature of the Earth. If your drone's flying 20 kilometers, and they're definitely drones that can do 20 kilometers with 3 kilograms of payload because I make them, or I used to, you just have degradation of your signal, and it could be from trees, it could be from hills in as your drone descends and loses altitude. So if you can lock on from, say, 500 meters altitude or about 500 meters up, and then the drone can keep going, it doesn't matter if you lose signal in the last couple of hundred meters. And that could be from geography, it could be from weather, it could be from jamming. That does make sense. And that seems to be where Ukrainian companies focus on, is that last little stage. But lock on from 3 kilometers, I'm just sat there going, why? The human pilot may get closer and go, oh, actually, no, I don't want to do that. And the thing I often hear is just like, the human pilot is still going to be able to do things and AI is just never going to be able to do, like fly around inside a building and realize I could hit the tank, but there's a bunch of 155 shells over there, so I'm going to hit that and just take down the entire place. So I think this is where it's interesting to look at what seems to be funded by non-Ukrainian governments, companies, investors versus where do Ukraine put their money? And if I was to look at where areas could be useful, like Dimko, you and I both know him, and he was saying, he did an interview, and one of the things, I'm not even sure if it was a view, and he was saying, look, we need people to do all sorts of roles. Like we need people to just literally review the video that I record and see if they can spot stuff that I missed.
It was, yeah, it was a conversation I had. He was out in the field in Zaporizhia.
Yeah, and I just sat there, I was hearing that going, that's a great thing to throw an AI at. You've got all of this data. Maybe you could free up some humans to look through it. And maybe you can also give Dimko a bit of rest, because one of the things you're saying is like you see probably photos of him just looking at a screen for like hours at a time. What if you could take some of the workload off the pilot? Or what if the pilot could potentially be just essentially monitoring a couple of aircraft because he's not having to be laser focused on the screen to try and spot something? So then you have essentially, machine vision algorithm or whatever you've trained looking for targets, and rather than him just flying and looking for targets all the time, he's then managing a number of drones. That seems to be like not as sexy as like Skynet, essentially what I don't know, the International Drone Capability Coalition seem to want, or others, but actually just reducing the workload on the warfighter. One of the feature of my drone, which I insisted on, actually myself and Max from Drone Space, we both insisted on, is our drones have to be open source. So my drones can be flashed to any of the 3 popular flight control systems, which are Betaflight, iNav, and ArduPilot. Most FPVs fly on Betaflight. But there are some units who fly on something called INAV, and even some who fly on RD pilot. Why am I bringing this up? Because if your drone is on INAV or RD pilot, you can do mission planning, which basically means you could hypothetically queue up a bunch of drones to just take off, I don't know, say a couple of minutes apart and just go out on a bearing. And then the pilot, rather than piloting the drone all the way to the target, the drone can be told to power on once it's within a certain rough area. Now it's going to have error in terms of where it is because GPS doesn't work. But then if your pilot can then take control in like the last couple of minutes, hit something, and then the next one powers up, and then he's then basically just striking or deciding what to strike. Versus most of the time, you see these guys and the drone's just cruising at level, which basically means you're putting it to a certain altitude and having a throttle which holds it, but the pilot's still having to do that. What happens if the pilot's not spending, 20 minutes of every flight before it gets spicy in the last 30 seconds? What happens if the drones are just queuing into an area because like a bunch of enemies are coming in, and all of a sudden your pilot's only taking control at the last minute? And this is even more important than it sounds because it's an EW contested space and an EW saturated space. So you can only fly so many drones within a given area before essentially you start jamming each other. So if rather than taking up 20 minutes of that part of the EW spectrum, you're only taking it up for like, I don't know, 5 minutes, you're still improving your utilization of that part of the electronic warfare or the electromagnetic spectrum.
And your pilot is sharper mentally for when it counts as well.
Yes. So when it comes to, I don't know, what AI, whatever you want to call it, I mean, some of the stuff which people called AI is not AI, but I digress. But there are a lot of things that can be done to take the burden off the pilot or to give him more awareness of what's going on around him. And I think that seems to be where a lot of Ukrainian companies seem to be focusing. And I think those guys have a pretty good idea of what the actual warfighter needs versus what we seem to think they need. It's like we seem to develop what we think they want. Ukrainian companies will just go and ask them and then develop what they ask for.
And then
Seems more
iterate
sensible.
it on a
Yeah.
weekly basis, which means you need that close contact and cooperation rather than a sort of intermittent presumption of what's going to be useful. Well, Alex, this is a tremendous pleasure. I know the audience will appreciate the level of detail and expertise that you can bring to this discussion, and I hope to do it again in the near future. For today, though, it's been a tremendous pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk.